Ladies and gentlemen, if you're looking to build the dream $1,000 gaming PC build in 2024, then guess what? You're in the right place, because throughout this video, we're going to do exactly that. We've gathered some of the latest and greatest components that are going to be awesome for a gaming PC that's going to be able to cope with all of the latest titles, including things like Dragon Age, the other one that I've forgotten, Star Wars Outlaws. I mean, that comes out in just a couple of weeks, and it is going to be incredible. And I know exactly what you're thinking, British people.
Oh, he's English. Why is he talking in dollars, not pounds? I can't do the conversion.
Well, the good news is it doesn't matter where you live or the currency they actually use. We're going to leave current pricing to everything located down below in your local currency. Hopefully, we can't do all of them. So you can see exactly how much this costs, well, for yourself, in your own currency. Don't say I don't ever do anything for you. Let's start this gaming PC build and show you just how awesome it can be right after a short word from this video's sponsor. Intel Gamer Days is back for 2024, and there are some insane deals to be had on the latest gaming gear. This MSI sold laptop is now available up to £350 off the RRP, and comes packing the mighty Intel Core i7-14700HX processor for powerful gaming performance. But that's far from all. There are so many deals across a huge range of devices that now is the perfect time to get game ready for the colder months. You can even get a free copy of Assassin's Creed Shadows with a qualifying purchase, which will save you even more. So why not level up your gaming experience today? Check out Intel Gamer Days with the link down below. So yes, this is very much going to be a price to performance rig, and these are always my favorite to do really, because I don't think PC gaming has to be that expensive. I mean, it is always going to be more than consoles once you've taken everything into account, but obviously you gain the money back over time as games are a lot cheaper, you can use a mouse and keyboard, and there are a whole bunch more games to actually play. You don't have to wait for the remasters that are essentially the same anyway. And the way we're going to start this off is actually with the motherboard. And if you haven't already guessed, we are going for an AMD system here, so this is B650, a little bit more expensive than A620, but it's a much higher quality board. You've got more bandwidth, and especially if you're going to upgrade it later, you tend to find that it can accept more power essentially on the CPU socket, which is great for performance. You don't want to be limiting if you are going to make some changes. So this is the Eagle AX from Gigabyte in the UK. It costs roughly around about £150, same actually in dollars or so, about 150. And as you can see, it's not bare bones, but it's not got like a huge amount of stuff on it. You still have this M.2 slot that can take a PCIe Generation 5 SSD, which is cool, but you're probably not going to use that for ages. It does also have Wi-Fi, which is obviously really important if you need to connect to the internet and you don't have an Ethernet socket, and there's a decent amount of USB ports. This is one of the main upgrades really that you'll find versus A620. You just have a little bit better I/O, so decent enough, but nothing crazy. If you haven't built a gaming PC before, then don't worry, we're going to walk you through everything, but it's very straightforward. Just grab your motherboard and place it on top of the box, as it's easier to access everything, and even simple things just like having more light really does help you, means you can actually read what all of these tiny bits of text and things around the motherboard actually are and do. Essentially, this is your CPU socket. Here you're going to put your RAM, and you use two modules and you put them in slots 2 and slots 4, but obviously if you want to upgrade this at a later date you can use all 4, but please don't put them directly next to each other, as that will actually halve your speed. This top slot is for your SSD. As I say, this goes up to PCIe Gen 5 speeds, but then you've got some slower ones down here as well. Great for expandability, and to be honest, you don't even need Gen 5, so wouldn't really worry about it. Elsewhere on the board you have your power connections for your CPU and then your ATX. Down the bottom right you've got your power switch to actually get your PC to turn on. You plug this down the bottom. USB 2, USB-C, USB 3, HD audio, again to get the analog audio for your case to actually do anything. And then down the bottom here you also have some addressable RGB, so if you can use strips, maybe fans, something for your cooler, then these will either plug in down the bottom here or at the top. And then any fans, you want to plug them into these fan headers, and the CPU one that we will be using in just a second is actually helpfully coloured grey, so you know which one that is. It is time though for our first component to get well and truly intimate, and this is going to be the motherboard and the processor, and this is probably my favourite all-round chip at the moment. This is technically a current generation, but also previous generation. This is the Ryzen 5 7600, and this pretty much has the best bang for buck of any CPU that doesn't sort of go into the real budget category. So this is going to last you for a very long time. It's a 6-core chip, and very importantly, its single core performance is awesome. So this is going to be great for gaming. Obviously, if you do want to upgrade it at a later date, that is very easy to do so, but either way, just open up this little slot with this bit of metal. It requires a fair bit of force, catches some people out, but once you've done that, just open up your box, take your CPU out of its container, again being very careful despite the fact that these are a little bit more robust than your motherboards. then you can just gently lower this into place. You have these little notches to essentially help you like guide it into position. It's quite straightforward because you just need to be able to read the Ryzen text as long as the motherboard is facing towards you. Then you lower this piece of metal down, make sure you catch it with this little bit of hanger is the way I'd almost describe it. Then just with a fair bit of force, clip this down into position, and then this top cover should come off, and you can save this for later on. Essentially, if you're going to return your motherboard or maybe just wait a few days for a new CPU to arrive, something like that, then obviously you keep this to protect the socket, but not essential. With your CPU installed, it's then time to move on to the next component, which is going to be the RAM, or the memory. And this is a 32GB kit, and the easiest way of getting this down pretty much bang on to $1,000, because at the time of filming this is about $1,050, would actually be to drop down to 16GB of RAM, which is going to be absolutely fine. It's not going to really cause you an issue, but in terms of longevity and also helping your 1% lows in terms of frame rate, so potential stutters and things, having 32GB is going to help to prevent those, and it's not that much more money. So if you can grab Who's Greg? If you can grab 32GB of the stuff, then it is what I would recommend. This is Corsair Vengeance, and the way to install it is just find this little notch and then line it up with this groove in the middle, and then you just push that down into position until it clicks on both sides. And you will need to open up these slots if you haven't already, but I assure you it is very straightforward. But if you haven't pushed them in all of the way, then this is one of the most common ways that PCs won't boot and people don't understand what's gone wrong. Always check all of the power connections to make sure that they're nice and tight, and also press your RAM in all of the way just to make sure it can't go in anymore. This is actually quite a low latency kit, and it is AMD Expo, so we can overclock this in the motherboard with the Expo profiles to essentially get more performance, but I wouldn't worry about it too much as long as you're buying something that's fairly fast and fairly low latency with 32GB. But as I say, links to everything are located down below. At this point in the video, you're then going to want to grab the only two tools that you should need to complete a gaming PC, which is a larger size Phillips head and then a smaller Phillips head cross screwdriver. And this is actually for the SSD. And the one we're using here, the packaging, I've cut it in half as you can see. It is the UD30 from Silicon Power, and this is a PCI Gen 4 SSD, relatively fast for the money, but is essentially trying to save you a fair bit of cash. Now, getting this installed is very straightforward. Just remove this little screw on our heatsink. This obviously helps to take the heat away from the SSD and just essentially gives it a larger surface area, and then your fans can blow this out of your case, at least in theory. It's very straightforward. Just grab the SSD, lower this down into position, and then it kind of clicks into place, and then you press that back down, grab this heatsink, and if you haven't already, remove the little bit of like plastic film that will be on this, because otherwise it's not really going to do that much. Then you just line that up and position it back down. But I say this in every video, so if you haven't seen one before, I'd always advise really that you get an SSD that's on sale, as typically this is the best way to maximize bang for buck. You want something that's fast, but still costs a reasonable amount of money. So sometimes something like a Samsung 990 Pro is really expensive. Other times actually they're on sale, they're pretty reasonable. So it depends what you're trying to do and how much everything else is. But this one from Silicon Power tends to be pretty good value straight out the gate. And then yes, the bit in the video that I've almost been dreading, because excuse the pun, but I know I'm going to get a fair bit of heat for this. Sound like Austin Powers then. This is the AMD stock cooler, and this has like a big bad rap essentially in the PC gaming space.
Don't use the stock cooler, you're not pro if you don't use that.
But the thing is, as long as you're buying, again, the non-X version of the 7600, you get this inside the box and it will be fine. It will work. Yes, obviously upgrade room and stuff, all of that is affected, but you can just upgrade it later. Use this today. Don't cut back on things like your SSD to half the capacity, or again, half the capacity of the RAM, because if you want to fit it in the exact same price budget, essentially you'd have to cut back on something else. So I'd much rather that you use this. It's also very easy to install, so great for beginners, and then, as I say, upgrade it later. And actually, whilst we're on this topic, this is probably a good point to address the elephant in the room that everyone seems to comment about all of the time, which is this stuff, which is thermal compound, and when you need to use it. Essentially, most coolers actually, if you buy them new at least, come with this stuff pre-applied, so you'll see it, don't touch it, on the back of your cooler. It's like a grey paste essentially, and this obviously helps the transfer between the cooler and the IHS, or technically it's the other way around. The heat obviously goes into the heatsink and then the fan blows it away. So you will need to use some if you are buying a used cooler or you've used it before like I have, but some coolers will also not have it pre-applied, but will give you some inside the box, which obviously allows you to reapply it if you are going to swap out your CPU or something like that. But either way, if you do need to use it, just add like a small pea-sized amount in the middle of your chip. Some people will say that you need to like push it down and spread it evenly, which you can if you really care about 1 or 2 degrees. But when you screw this down, as long as you're doing it in like a cross pattern, it will actually even the pressure anyway. If you don't believe me, install it, lift it back up, and you'll see you should have like a nice even spread of thermal paste. If you don't, feel free to spread it out, but it's not something that I've ever really needed to do. In order to get this particular cooler installed though, we will need to remove the default AM5 mounting hardware, which I do always find a little bit peculiar, bearing in mind we are using an AMD stock cooler, but this comes off by design and a lot of coolers will need to do it. You'll reveal these like 4 pegs in the board, so just take these off, then you can pick up your cooler, and as long as you have already got this thermal compound down, you can then just line this up with those holes, and then as I said, just screw down one of the corners slightly, and then with the other, fair bit of force, do the same until that one catches, and then repeat for all 4 until it is safe and secure. At this point, you then want to grab this little CPU cable, and then the one we showed you earlier, which is this little grey fan header, just plug that over the port, and then with this cable, just neaten it up just by tucking it there. And then actually your motherboard is now complete, ready to go in your chassis. And I realize at this point that we haven't actually discussed the case or the chassis at all yet. And this is one of my favorites really when it comes to price to performance. It's not completely perfect. I mean, the main thing about it is that the build quality is almost as good as something like a Corsair 4000D, but not quite there. But I really like the fact that it quite literally has edge, right? It's quite unique. There's not really many cases that have this. You've got some, I don't want to say dents, like indentations in the glass there, and obviously you've got the sort of crystal effect on the front. It comes with RGB fans as standard on the front as well. So there's definitely a lot of value here. I think at the time of filming, you can actually get this for around about £75, just under $100, that sort of price mark. So almost normal for a chassis, right? But obviously we've seen a lot of inflation recently. So a lot of cases are now over the £100 or dollar mark, which is a little bit of a shame, but I guess that is life. We will remove, he says, remove this back cover. This is what I mean about build quality. Like, it's fine, but like in areas it's a little bit on the cheaper side, but to be fair, it does partly redeem itself when you look around the back and you find that you do have this fan and RGB hub, which is quite cool. Granted, you can only expand it by 1, which is a little bit annoying, but if you want to add a rear fan, fantastic. And you also do have quite a lot of thickness spare here, so if you do want to add hubs and things, then it's going to be quite easy. And you do also have these little cable grommets, which are becoming surprisingly rare actually on budget cases. Loads of rim down the bottom, so it's a very normal chassis. As I say, not quite as well built as a 4000D, but seems to be slightly bigger actually, and is going to be pretty easy to work in. Just lay your case down flat on the table like so. Then you can pick up your motherboard. We do have these standoffs that I think were pre-applied, but as I say, it's been ages since I've built on this. If not, you can just remove these with the tool that comes in the bag. And obviously, if you're going for micro ATX, you will need to move them slightly anyway, so where it says M. But if you're going for a full-size ATX board, you can just lower this down into position. Have this like central one here kind of catch it if possible. Just like that, it will kind of click into position. And then you will have a little bag of goodies somewhere, should be tied around the back, that will have all of your screws inside. Slightly unusually on this case, it's actually the hex screws that you need for the motherboard to just secure these into position. And then once you've done that, you can see that your gaming PC is really starting to take shape now. I mean, as I say, it's not going to win awards for the most crazy thing, but I think it all goes together quite well, and it's going to look great once you've actually got this turned on. We then lay our PC back down under the overhead so you can actually see what we're doing. Then we grab our USB 3 and it plugs in just below this big ATX power connection. Below that we have our USB Type-C. At the top here we have our addressable RGB, only one right way of plugging this in. Then next to that we actually have one of our fan headers for our hub. Down the bottom we have our power switch, our power LEDs and our HD LEDs, and the easiest way for me to describe this would be to say read the manual, because it tells you the exact layout. But if your memory's good, then your power is the top right of the block. And that sounds complicated, which is why I say look in the manual, but these plug in very straightforward and simply. Just make sure you're plugging them into the right one. And then last but certainly not least, we have our HD audio, and this plugs into this little white connection at the bottom left. Sometimes, and I imagine it's going to happen on this case, when you plug your power supply in, it kind of clashes with this cable and you need to plug it out, unplug it, and then plug it back in once you're done. So like if you can't get your power supply in, that's why essentially. But yes, there you have hopefully some very neat cables all connected into their respective positions. And I think that's actually a fantastic segue into our next component, which is the power supply. This is obviously the most boring bit, but is still very much necessary. As far as budget ones go, this is the one I like to use. It's the MSI Mag A650BN. I think that last letter might change depending on which part of the world you're in. But this is one of the cheapest power supplies that seems to be decent enough, right? It's very easy to skimp out and buy the cheapest power supply possible, but I don't trust them. There is something called the power supply tier list that's actually quite a good way of checking whether your power supply is good or not. I'll leave that links down below. But this is also a non-modular power supply, so this is one of the ways that it is actually a little bit cheaper, as all of the cables come pre-connected. But that's the door, probably the postman.
Hello.
All right, cheers, thank you very much. Oh, it was Amazon. Some dog worming tablets, because my life is so exciting. Anyway, as I was saying, this is a 650 watt unit, so pretty good actually in terms of power output. Obviously, if you're going to upgrade to a really high-end graphics card at a later date, I would advise that you get a better one now, but 650 should be sufficient, and the CPU on this doesn't consume much power, so you should be set. We'll just get this rotated round, look, so we can actually access our big hole at the back. Fan facing downwards, this is as long as your case actually has ventilation on the bottom, which most do, but sometimes you get cases where the power supply goes in at the side. Obviously then make sure that your fan is at the side, wherever the vent is essentially. But you just lower this down into position. That cable is actually fine on this one, so we don't need to move that. Then we can give this a spin, line up our power supply holes with the edge of the case, screw this into position with yet more hex screws, and then of course you'll be left with all of these power connections that you need to get plugged in somewhere. And a lot of people get very intimidated by this, but I assure you it's very straightforward because again they're all labeled and a lot of them are pretty obvious. So this is our large ATX. We also have our CPU connection that says CPU on the side of it. These ones are a little bit funny. We've got our Molex connection and SATA. These are for 2.5-inch SSDs, hard drives, or any accessories. So this counts as an accessory, this little addressable RGB fan hub. So that uses one SATA to get its power. We do also have our graphics card connections, which are these ones that say PCIe on them. And I will say, be careful because you only get 2 on this particular unit, which is going to be fine for most people, but if you want to be clever and buy some fancy RGB fans that actually use PCIe for power, then you'll probably find that you won't actually have enough, which would be pretty annoying. And I will also say that these can be split into 6 pins, which is why we have these 2 like dangly bits that come off. So most graphics cards, you'll put them together and this is what we call an 8-pin, but if you take that away, it's a 6. So some graphics cards will be 6, some will be 8, some will be a combination of both. But once again, let's just feed these cables through to their respective homes. So our ATX can go in this middle chamber, our CPU can go all the way up here at the top right. Graphics card connections will also plug in underneath. And then last but certainly not least, we'll grab this little SATA for our hub and then connect this to our SATA connection. Again, this is not reversible, only one right way of doing this. Just clicks into position, and then all of these spare cables we can now just kind of stuff into our hard drive cage down the bottom. This is one of the problems, if you like, by going for a non-modular power supply. It's a bit harder to tidy up, but to be honest, there's not a huge amount plugged into it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Once you've done that, you will of course need to plug in those power supply connections, and I did say that they were obvious, ATX and then CPU at the top left. This is definitely a whole lot easier because we've not got a really big cooler that takes up all of the space, or like a all-in-one liquid up here that kind of blocks everything off. If this is going to be your starter PC, this is going to be probably the easiest one you ever built. But with that, I think it's just one more component left to go, everyone's favorite, obviously the most exciting part and probably the bit that you've picked before anything else. Wise decision. This is going to be the graphics card, and interestingly enough, when this first launched, it wasn't that it wasn't good, it was just classic AMD. Wasn't priced correctly. This is the RX 7700 XT, and I will start by saying as well that you don't necessarily need to get this particular power color Hellhound. I've actually priced this based on the cheapest 7700 XT at the time of filming, and I'd recommend really that you do the same unless there's something specific that you won't or maybe don't want. This is a 12 gig graphics card, so nice and future-proof there if you want to play, well, AAA titles and have textures and things turned up without running into issues. And you will also have loads of power on this as well, so you should be able to run those games in the first place. I mean, the difference between AMD and Nvidia pretty much comes down to how much you want to use their technologies, because if you care about ray tracing and you also care about DLSS, frame generation, all of those things, Nvidia typically does it better. But if you just want to play, like, especially multiplayer titles at the highest possible frame rate, then you do get much better value actually with AMD. But this particular variant I think is really attractive. It does give off like a blue light, which some people won't like, but I think you can actually turn that off. And as you can see at the top here, you do have those two 8 pins as well. So this is what I mean. This is going to be your limit really when it comes to power. If it required 3, then you'd typically be out of luck. But it's a pretty good graphics card, and it is available for a very good price, and is one of the best value GPUs you can actually get at the moment. Now, you will need to take these slot covers out. I've obviously already done this. As I say, I've used this case before, but it is just a couple of screws. Then you can pick up your graphics card. You can lay it down flat if you want it to be slightly easier, but this isn't too difficult, to be honest. Then give it a good push to get that audible click, and then you can just screw it back down into position. And then once you've done that, I think it's just one last thing to do, which is to grab those power connections that we've cable managed earlier, pinch them together and just push them into the slot. That is actually about it. That is our gaming PC, well and truly complete. And as I say, not really that complicated as far as a gaming PC goes, because all of your fans are all pre-done for you. You don't really need to plug much in at all, especially if you're using the stock cooler. So simple. This is pretty much as easy as it gets. So I'm hoping this will work. If you do want to use this with a Ryzen 9000 chip, you will have to flash the BIOS before you can use it, but this board does actually have what we call QFlash Plus, so you don't need an existing chip to do that, which is great. So yes, I think this is going to be a great all-round rig, but we need to see if it works. Obviously, we need to grab ourselves a monitor, keyboard, mouse, and of course, this lovely PC-centric mouse mat, available today at pccentric.store. Okay then, I won't lie to you, this is definitely going to be the most nerve-wracking bit of your build. Will it turn on? Make sure you've actually got the switch on the power supply set to the 1. And as long as you're getting some spinning, that's always a good sign. If you do have any issues, as I say, make sure everything's plugged in properly, including that power switch. Sometimes you can get that confused and you plug it into the power LED. Make sure it is on the power switch. You've got your monitor obviously plugged in and on the right input. That's also something that plagues me every time. We're getting a load of lights on the motherboard. As long as they keep moving, that's good. Red lights, not so good, but typically takes around about 30 to 60 seconds on a Ryzen rig for something to show up. But essentially you want to get into the BIOS or something that says, or something that looks like that, any form of like visual cue on screen essentially, and then you know that you've done everything right. I mean, we will go into the BIOS in just a second, which you can get to by mashing the delete key. This is where we're going to turn on our RAM overclocking. This is where we're going to tune our fans and just make sure everything is connected. But otherwise, all we need to do is install Windows, and this is very straightforward. You just grab a USB flash drive with a copy of Windows on it that you've downloaded from the website. I've made a full guide about this and also a full video on what to do after you've built your gaming PC, how to get everything set up. But yes, everything works, so let's jump into the games. And so then, ladies and gentlemen, through the power of editing and almost taking myself out with the side panel, here we are, all set up and ready to go. Just the finishing touch to go on. And there we have our completed rig. And I think you'll agree with me, actually, that it is a very attractive system, right? I mean, especially from the front, looks super high-end, literally quite edgy. Yes, the stock cooler doesn't exactly shout and scream style and substance. But to be honest, if you've just got into PC gaming, chances are you'd be none the wiser anyway, right? I think this is a great all-rounder, and for $1,000 or $1,050, as I say, roughly at the time of filming, I think you're getting a lot of PC for the money. But shall we see how it performs? And let's kick things off with this. This is some Ghost of Tsushima. This is a game that's obviously just released on PC a couple of months ago. It was on PlayStation a few years ago, I believe. But the good thing about PC gaming is we seem to get all of the titles now, which is great. And I do want to draw your attention to a few things if you're new to this channel. The main one really being the stats on the top left-hand corner of your screen. Frame time graph that shows you how smooth everything is. So if you get any spikes, that's bad. That's essentially meaning we're getting some noticeable stutter. Obviously, the frame rate itself, we have our CPU utilization, RAM utilization, and then GPU and CPU thermals and temperatures, wattages, all of that good stuff. And obviously, we'll be using this to assess how well this PC does actually play all of these games. And as you can clearly see at the moment, we're actually getting a really nice frame rate of around about 90 FPS, so better than console level experience really. And this is actually running at 4K at very high settings, but we are cheating a little bit by using FSR. So this is AMD's way of essentially scaling the image up from a lower resolution to a higher one. It works quite well here actually. The earlier versions of FSR looked a little bit soft, and as this is set to performance mode, it's nowhere near as sharp as native 4K, but it doesn't actually look too bad at all. I think this is quite a nice trade-off really, and especially if you're going to be sort of playing a game like this that does require just a little bit more timing, let's say, and you want everything to feel super smooth and tight, then obviously higher frame rate is better than visual fidelity and quality. But yes, this is definitely running very well. But having said that, one thing that I will draw draw your attention to is actually the CPU temperature at the top left-hand corner of your screen, because that's currently running at around about 91, 92 degrees. Now, granted, it is extremely hot in here. It's the height of summer, and we've had all of the windows shut. It's not ideal. We've got studio lights on. But yes, around about 90 degrees on the CPU isn't great, and this is why I say if you can get a larger CPU cooler, this will definitely help you out. But this is going to be absolutely fine to run for now. If you're running in the winter, it's obviously not so much of a big deal. And I have also tuned this as well to get slightly better acoustics. I was going to say temperatures, it's the opposite. Whereas if we turned all of the fans up, we could obviously expect that to come down a little bit, but it's not going to change dramatically. You might be able to get it to 85 or so. But yes, if you do want lower CPU temperatures, obviously you will have to go for something else. But as an overall experience, again, for the money, I think this is pretty much bang on, to be honest. I'll also draw your attention to the fact that we're using over 16 gig of RAM at the moment, which is why I say if you go for 32, it's definitely going to allow your PC to run better if you're running some more intense titles. But you know what, ladies and gentlemen, if you really want to push things to the limit, despite the fact that this is technically an older title, there's only one game for it really, and that is Cyberpunk 2077, and this is the Phantom Liberty update. And as you can see, everything has got a whole lot more intense. But I do now want to draw your attention to the CPU utilization in Cyberpunk, because if you have a look, you can see all of the cores have essentially now lit up, but that temperature is just way too high really to comfortably recommend this exact system without upgrading the cooler, because our clock speed is now actually decreasing because we are hitting that thermal limit. I mean, you'd expect just under around about 5 gigahertz or so on this CPU, but as you can see, we're actually getting to around about 4.6 or so. It doesn't appear to be impacting our overall frame rate though, as our utilization is still around about 99%, but it is definitely something to bear in mind that better cooling could give you better performance. But I mean, the game still runs really very well, around about 70 FPS or so. This is now at 1440p, not 4K, at the Ultra preset. So this is also using FSR 2.1 set to quality as part of that Ultra preset, and this is a fantastic way to play. I mean, if you haven't actually played Cyberpunk on PC, it looks fantastic, even without any ray tracing, because that is what we are running at the moment. But if you do want to up the ante, then obviously you will want to turn the ray tracing on, and this is where, as I say, an Nvidia card would be the better choice if this is specifically what you want to do. But if we go into the options menu, and then we have our ray trace reflections, shadows, lighting. Personally speaking, I think shadows is what is actually going to look the best. I know reflections gets all of the headlines, but I don't really think it matters that much because the pre-baked ones are still like decent enough, whereas this just kind of improves the lighting of the game in a way that I would say is probably more noticeable. I say this because this is actually the way that I played Cyberpunk when it came out a couple of years ago, and if you do decide to go for these settings, I think you'd be pretty happy actually, around about 65 to 70 FPS still. So this is still a great looking game, and whilst we do have some ray tracing, it's not completely toppling our game. So if we now go into the settings once again, and then ultimately we do turn the ray tracing up to max, so we go to Ray Traced Ultra, make sure our FSR is set the same. I say Ultra, this isn't Ultra because technically that would be the path tracing that you can get in this, but you're looking at one of the top Nvidia cards to properly run that without any issues at all. And as you can now see, the game does look better, but I mean, it's way more noticeable that our frame rate has dropped almost in half to around about 43 FPS. So if you do have an Nvidia card, then I would definitely suggest that you play around with more settings. But if you're going for AMD, then just try the shadows because it doesn't impact you too much, and you still get a game that does look fantastic. Obviously, if you're going to be playing at 1080p, then you probably could have these settings if you wanted to, but the point is it is very flexible. That's the point of PC gaming, you get it how you want. But AMD is typically the choice if you kind of wouldn't mind ray tracing, but you're not too fussed either way. But ladies and gentlemen, I now think it's time for our multiplayer titles, kicking things off with some Halo Infinite. And as you can see, we're currently running this at around about 100 FPS actually, and we were actually running into some, I would say, serious, significant issues with our CPU in Cyberpunk, because while we weren't getting any stuttering, you can now clearly see that the clock speeds on the CPU has increased where it's not actually hammering it quite as hard. So our temperature goes down, and this ultimately means that you are going to see better performance in certain titles. So again, last time I'm going to mention it, if you get a better cooler, that is going to help you out. But yes, around about 110 FPS or so. At the moment, we're actually running this at 1440p without any upscaling techniques at all, because it actually isn't in this particular title, but we are outputting this at 4K, running this in like a borderless window mode at high settings. So yes, this is going to be a fantastic way to play Halo. But if we now go into the options menu and then turn this down to 1080p, we can see how this affects the frame rate. But it doesn't actually seem to affect it by as much as you might expect. There definitely are gains, but I wouldn't say it's night and day, around about 120 FPS or so. Now, part of me would have said that this was down to CPU bottlenecking, but if you look at the top left-hand corner of your screen, you can see that the GPU utilization is still around about 98-99%, so that doesn't appear to be getting in the way. I mean, 120 FPS is still good, but it's not exactly crazy now, is it? But of course, ladies and gentlemen, there is one title that you guys are always so keen for, and it's not Call of Duty Warzone actually, it's this, some Apex Legends, and we've currently got this running at 1440p high, and as you can clearly see, we're getting a pretty astronomical frame rate of around about 220 FPS or so. I mean, it's not enough to actually help me from not being destroyed as soon as I hit the ground. Clearly I need a little bit more practice, but once again, this is a title that's going to run really well on PC and really well on our system. But okay everyone, it actually appears as if I've been revived, which is definitely a rarity in this game because I'm not in the game long enough actually to make it to this stage. But we've now turned this down to 1080p, and interestingly enough, our frame rate again hasn't really changed that dramatically. We're still getting around about 200 FPS or so, but as you can see it does dip into the 170s or so. And I think this is actually going to be caused by CPU bottlenecking, because if you do look at the top left hand corner of your screen, you can see around about 83% GPU utilization, which means that we have some graphics card that we are leaving on the table. And if you look at the CPU temperatures, again, 96 degrees. So I think unfortunately this is one of the quite rare occasions actually where you are going to be missing out if you don't get a better cooler. I mean, you know, a lot of people buy better cooling to reduce their CPU from 80 degrees to 70, and that's not really going to affect your performance. But here you can clearly see that your clock speeds are changing a fair bit and they're not as high as I would like. So yes, if you are going to go for this PC, again, do make sure that you are running an upgrade to your CPU if you're going to be running intense titles. But we are in the summer, so you could definitely get away with this. This isn't a terrible idea, but I think there is definitely some room for improvement. And I guess it is a shame that our PC does have this fundamental weakness, because otherwise it's pretty awesome. There's not really many things I would change. You could definitely optimize it a little bit more by changing one of the fans from the bottom of the front to maybe the top or the rear, and this probably would reduce your CPU just a little bit further as well, just to give you a little bit more headroom. But it is an attractive system, it's got loads of potential, it will run absolutely fine for now, but yes, an upgrade to your cooling is probably going to be optimal. So let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. What do you make of our system? What do you make of our PC? Are you happy with the performance, and do you agree with me that clearly a better cooler would have actually been a good idea here? But we'd love to hear from you, so smash the like button if you've enjoyed this, get yourself subscribed, and of course if you do want to check out current pricing on anything in this PC, including the cooler we'd probably recommend for this, you can find that all listed down below with our affiliate links. And while you're down there, why not bag yourself a bargain with Intel Gamer Days? This limited time sale brings you the best of Intel all in one place, with huge discounts on a range of devices packing the latest Intel Core mobile processors. Not only do you get great gaming performance, but also modern features like super fast Wi-Fi 7, DDR5 memory, Thunderbolt 5, and a whopping 24 cores of CPU horsepower. There are masses of deals to be had, but hurry, they won't last long, so grab them while you can with the link down below. But thank you so much for watching this video. We'll catch you in the next one.